Welcome to the Iron and Ivy Incunabulum. Please adjust your seats and prepare your mind. This may be unpleasant for some individuals. Discretion is advised.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Iron and Ivy Incunabulum, Season 1, American Antiquities by Josiah Priest. For this episode, I want to jump straight into the recap because I have plenty of ranting to do. So here we go, the recap. Last time, we continued our endeavor of connecting historical events, archaeological claims, and mythological references in the most coherent fashion that I am able. We began the episode by detailing the massive series of seismic events known as the New Madrid earthquakes, noting their devastating impact on the geography of America and how they were interpreted by Native American groups as a sign from their god to resist the white colonizers. We also discussed the transformation of Kentucky from contested hunting grounds to the home of America's most determined and possibly deranged militia. This short chapter in American history, which was shaped by conflict with Native American nations and their British instigators, directly influenced the high level of military participation by Kentuckians in the War of 1812. We also shared claims of ancient scripts found in the Americas that resemble Phoenician or Libyan characters, suggesting that voyages were made to the western continent long before Columbus. About halfway through the episode, I attempted to provide a breakdown of the dual identity of Atlas, distinguishing between the Greek Titan and the legendary king of Atlantis, in order to contextualize the book's claims about ancient history, mythology, and the conflation of the two. Near the end, we read a report of a petrified tree stump found deep underground near Cincinnati, Ohio. Josiah Priest posits that this tree is evidence of an antediluvian presence in America. We concluded with more of Josiah's theological and geological arguments regarding the biblical flood and the movement of the Earth's crust, arguments that I personally believe fall apart upon further investigation. And now, the rant of the Lost Ark. Alright, so the only reason this even came up is because in American Antiquities, Josiah, we were talking about the possibility of Egyptian mummies and hieroglyphs being found in America. Josiah has to figure out, how did Egyptians get to America? So, there is a historical premise to believe that the Egyptians, under specifically Pharaoh Necho, conducted a sea voyage from the Red Sea heading southeast around the eastern coast of the continent of Africa, around the southern Cape, up the western side of Africa through the Atlantic to the Strait of Gibraltar, back into the Mediterranean, back to probably Alexandria, Egypt. Or maybe it had a different name back then, I don't know. Back to Egypt. And so Josiah posited that when coming around the Cape at the southern tip of Africa, there is a current in the ocean that will pull you west. So Josiah's theory was that it's not impossible that some Egyptian voyage that went around the southern Cape of Africa drifted off and ended up in America. That's possible. It could have happened at any time. It didn't have to be under Pharaoh Necho, but that was just his evidence that Egypt has made this trip, to pair with the other evidence that the currents do run in such a way that if you were off course even by a little bit, if you're not properly positioned on the sea, you could very easily end up in South or Central or maybe even the southern parts of North America. Actually, it seems that the Gulf of Mexico has something to do with this, because there was little hints sprinkled here and there about the Gulf of Mexico. I think someone said something about, because of waters pressing up against that coast there in the Gulf, it is causing it to come more and more inland or something. Like, the Gulf hasn't always been that wide. Something like water erosion has been wearing away the land, making the Gulf larger and larger. And that made me think of the thing that I said about the Mediterranean Sea, how when supposedly Atlantis was destroyed out in the Atlantic, the waves from that event were pushed into the Mediterranean and then back out into the ocean, and the ebb and flow of that, it made the seas crazy so that people couldn't travel too far west into the Atlantic for a long time. So they say. This is all conjecture. None of us were there, okay? But it does make sense. And it seems like the other side of that could be the Gulf of Mexico. Just how the water was rushing into the Mediterranean and then back out to the ocean. Likewise, the Gulf of Mexico. And then back out into the ocean. And there's a current there that will carry whatever's on the surface of the water to the west. The current flows to America. Just interesting details. But Pharaoh Necho, I got hung up when I heard that name in this book, because at first I thought I could have sworn that I heard theories that this guy took the ark for safekeeping. Not that I believed this, but I felt like, for whatever reason, in the back of my mind, I feel like I've heard this before. And the period, I would say, from Solomon all the way through to Ezra coming back and rebuilding the temple, it's all kind of fuzzy for me. I don't know the prophets very well. I don't know the later kings very well. I've only recently, in my journey of Christianity, began to understand the period of David and Solomon. That was very fuzzy to me for a long time. And Samuel too, that whole period. Really, sidebar, before I came to Christ, I was familiar with maybe the first chapter of Genesis and maybe a chapter of Revelation and maybe a couple of verses in the Psalms and a couple of verses in the Gospels. And I was only, and probably some Leviticus stuff, but I was only familiar with this stuff for the sake of contradicting it. I was one of those angsty, rebellious, not quite atheist. I was very New Age most of my life, or, very spiritual, but, being without Christ at the time. New Age probably is the best title for it. But, I knew a couple things in the Bible, but I only sought them out for the sake of pointing out the contradictions and showing that it's rubbish. But once I finally surrendered to Christ, I did read through the Bible several times, and the middle portions were always the darkest for me. Just like the most unknown for me personally. Like I was saying, from pretty much pretty much from Solomon, somewhere around Solomon's reign, all the way through until Jesus comes. Except for Daniel. I was pretty familiar with Daniel. And Jonah has always been, from the very beginning, one of my favorite books, period. I was going to say Old Testament books, but it's just one of my favorite books. I think it's a really... I can tell by reading this story that I'm missing something. I can tell that there's some kind of deeper meaning to this story, particularly the end of it. It's a very mysterious story. That's, I think, what draws me to it. There's something about it that's just so... I don't even know how to put my finger on it, but I know that I'm missing something when I read it. And that excites me to investigate further. But anyway, Pharaoh Necho. I've been unfamiliar with this guy and this period of world history altogether, only until recently. And I guess for a quick 1,000-foot view of what we're going to talk about here today, we're going to start a little bit before Necho. I want to try to keep him the focus, since, that was the point that I led with, or the topic that I led with from the beginning. But we're going to be all over the place, because, first of all, I love burying the lead for you guys, telling you the point at the top. I was mistaken. I could have swore I heard something about Pharaoh Necho taking the ark, but I was wrong. It was a different pharaoh. In fact, there are several different possible culprits to have taken the ark, for good reasons or for vandalism or bad reasons, plundering versus guarding. And there's plenty of different theories for each side of that. But to try to stay on Pharaoh Necho, at least for now, his story, or what I want to say about his story, begins before him. Pharaoh Necho is identified by secular historians as Necho II. He was a pharaoh of Egypt's 26th dynasty. They say that he was from Egypt, specifically of the Site line, based in Sais, in the Nile Delta, which is a bit south of Egypt. Keep that in mind. He was the son and successor of Psamtik I, or Psammaticus I, who had reunified Egypt and established the dynasty after a period of Assyrian dominance and internal tribal fragmentation. You see, kind of, again, like I've said in the past about Greece, how they were a bunch of spread out tribes, the Athenians, the Ionians, the Trojans, the Spartans, the Cretians, the Macedonians. These are all different, quote-unquote, nation states or nations that are separate. This isn't one unified nation of Greece. These are all each their own separate nations. Well, the area of northern Africa had the same situation. A little bit different, because how there may not have been Greeks, there were Egyptians, but there were also Libyans and Sabians, and the Assyrians would poke their nose, even though the Assyrians were not from Africa, they were north of Israel, so they were kind of far away. There was a lot of conflict between Assyria and Egypt, and later on Babylon would also poke their nose in. But for the sake of the argument right here, the rulership in Egypt was constantly struggling between these different tribes, specifically Libyans, Sabians, and Assyrians. And Sabians were from the ancient nation known as Saba. Today, we would call that Ethiopia, which is just south of the Nile Delta. very close to where Necho was born. So it is possible that he was Ethiopian, or at least some kind of a proto-form. You know how these ancient genealogies work. Migration, mixing, migration, mixing. Necho II's name is interpreted as relating to something like carrying out the desire of the heart. He reigned from approximately 610 BC to 595 BC, about 15 years, and he was succeeded by his son Psamtik II, named after his father. His father Psamtik I, the way that he ended up taking dominant control of Egypt, it was through a racial revolution. They were being ruled by back and forth between Sabians or Ethiopians and Assyrians. Well, this is Egypt, and they wanted to make Egypt great again. So he was able, because of his, this is my own opinion here, I believe he could have been of a mixed ethnicity because he had strong ties to Egyptian through genetics, but he also had close ties to Ethiopia and the Sabians. So much so that he was able to take the throne as a quote-unquote full-blooded Egypt, making Egypt great again, while also being allied with the Sabians and Libyans who, had just recently been ruling over them. So this guy is able to get the throne back while still being allies with the people who were ruling over him. And later on in the story, I think not until Necho actually becomes pharaoh, he even goes so far as to become allies with Assyria. And in the Bible, when we see Babylon starting to invade Assyria, Necho actually goes out to defend Assyria against Babylon. And that's where the Bible story picks up at that part. It was pretty early in Necho's reign when he marched north to support the collapsing Neo-Assyrian Empire against the rising Neo-Babylonians, who were currently under Nabopolassar, which was the father of Nebuchadnezzar. Pharaoh Necho was able to take control of parts of Syria and Palestine for a time, reaching as far as the Euphrates. He built the world's greatest navy, as we have mentioned, and he did it with support from Greek and Phoenician expertise, positioning fleets on both the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts, and simultaneously making allies with Greek nations and Phoenician nations, along with his more local Libyans and Ethiopians. So this guy is making moves all over the place. He began, but did not complete, a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, an early precursor to the Suez Canal. According to Herodotus, it was an oracle that led him to stop the work. It was also Herodotus who reported that Necho commissioned a Phoenician expedition that sailed from the Red Sea around Africa and returned via the Mediterranean over about 3 years. The sailors report that the sun was on their right while rounding the southern tip is often cited as evidence that the voyage did in fact occur. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was Egypt's main rival during this time. After initial success, Egyptian forces under Necho were eventually defeated by the Babylonian crown prince Nebuchadnezzar at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. This ended Egyptian control over Syria-Palestine Nebuchadnezzar later threatened Egypt itself around 601 BC. Necho repelled the invasion, but extended Egyptian power in the region was permanently broken. However, he continued to encourage anti-Babylonian resistance among the ancient Near East, including Israel. The nation of Judah, under King Josiah, initially opposed him, but after Josiah's death, Judah became an Egyptian vassal for a short time, before eventually yielding to Babylon. In 609 BC, while marching north to help the Assyrians, who captured northern Israel about a century prior, Necho's forces encountered King Josiah of Judah at Megiddo. Josiah attempted to intercept him, and according to 2 Chronicles 35:20 through 24, Necho warned Josiah not to interfere, claiming divine authorization for his campaign. But Josiah persisted. The text says he was wounded by archers and died. Necho then removed Josiah's successor Jehoaz after a 3-month reign, took him captive to Egypt, where he later died, installed Jehoaz's brother Eliakim as a puppet king, renaming him Jehoiakim, and imposed a heavy tribute of 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold. A talent is equal to about 100 pounds. Judah thus became a short-lived Egyptian vassal state. After the Egyptian defeat at Carchemish, Babylonian influence replaced Egyptian control, setting the stage for the later Babylonian conquest of Judah and the exile. Necho did not suffer a dramatic end like King Josiah. His major setback was the crushing defeat at Carchemish in 605 BC, after which the king of Egypt came not again any more out of his land, regarding control of the region from the Brook of Egypt to the Euphrates, as stated in 2 Kings 24:7. He successfully defended Egypt's borders against a Babylonian probe around 601 BC and continued ruling until his natural death in 595 BC, and his dynasty continued under his successors for a time. Pharaoh Necho is mentioned in the historical books and prophetic literature of the Bible in connection with the final decades of the Kingdom of Judah. These references are found in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Jeremiah. And this is also around the last time that we will hear of the Ark, specifically during the reign of Josiah. Before Josiah took the crown, there was about 60 or 70 years of wicked rulership. Arguably the worst rulership in the history of Israel, at the time of the writing at least. It begins with Manasseh in 2 Kings 21. When Manasseh was 12 years old, he began to reign, and he reigned for 55 years, one of, I think actually maybe the longest reign of any king. Yet, he was the worst king. How do you square that? He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all the abominations that he hated, which would be building altars to foreign gods, sacrificing his own children, worshiping Baal and Asherah in the way that the other nations worship these foreign gods. He burned his sons as offerings. He uses fortune tellers and omens and mediums and necromancers. All the things. He went buck wild, Manasseh did. He sent prophets to Manasseh telling him, yo, man, you're going to destroy all of Israel because of this. But Manasseh doesn't care. God says, I'm going to send Babylon to destroy you. And it doesn't happen for, another 70 years, but Manasseh has a jolly old time, dies in peace, and is buried with his fathers. And then his son, Amon, who was 22 years old, began to reign. Now, this guy only reigned for 2 years, but he also followed in lockstep with his father Manasseh, did all the evil things. He abandoned the Lord, did not walk in the way of the Lord. And the servants of Amon conspired against him to put the king to death in his house. I think this part's kind of interesting because they don't really go into detail if these servants who conspired to kill Amon were also wicked, or were they good and just sick of the wickedness. Because Ammon is wicked. Israel was just reigned over by a wicked king for 55 years before that. It's been 70 years of wickedness. And there has to be some kind of good people still in the land. We can't, like we've said before about with the split in the north and the south, we can't just assume that everybody that was living in the north was just evil. Some people made the move, some people got out of Dodge. Some people probably were not down with what was happening and were killed. But it's not cookie cutter clean like that. There's no way. You can't assume that just because the king is evil, that everybody else is just following along with it and they're fine with it and that's what they want too. It's ridiculous. But it's weird because evil King Ammon is killed by his servants, but the people of the land struck down all those who had conspired against the king. And they made Josiah the king in his place. Josiah is an interesting one. He's probably one of my favorites. Maybe I just don't know enough about the other kings, but he's got a really good story. 2 Kings 22. Josiah was 8 when he began to reign. He reigned for 31 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and he walked in all the ways of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. And it took him 18 whole years. He reigned for 18 whole years, following God, before finally he has the brilliant idea to clean up the temple. Nobody was using Solomon's temple this whole time, at least since Manasseh. It was just collecting dust as some kind of an antique, old world building is what it was. Some people didn't even know what it was because they had been born and raised, surrounded by people that weren't involved in that. It was just a building, an old building. So Josiah basically says, go to the high priest, tell him to count all the money in the house of the Lord so that we can clean it up. Pay some carpenters and builders and masons and let them use it for buying timber and, repair the house. And then this high priest tells Josiah, I found the book of the law in the house of God. And it's like they hadn't seen this book in decades. And some people may have thought it didn't even exist. I think that's huge. That's a big deal. Alright, so they find the law. And what I was thinking is, what else would be in the temple that maybe they forgot about? What else was in there? You had some incense and an altar, right? Oh yeah, the ark. So Josiah commanded everybody to go inquire of the Lord for King Josiah and for the people and for all Judah concerning the words of the book that they have found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. So it's as if he didn't even realize how serious the sins of his fathers were. That's a pretty interesting perspective. Because imagine you just see your father doing his thing. And say your father was Manasseh. And some of these people just had no context to think that this is not right. I don't know, it's really deep, I think. So, the priest and all his little buddies who worked at the temple, they went to a prophet to ask what's going to happen. And what's pretty cool about this is actually this prophet is a woman. It's one of the very few mentions of a female prophet in the Bible. And her name was Huldah. Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum, the son of Tikva, son of Harahas, the keeper of the wardrobe. That's pretty interesting. If the garments still existed from Adam and Eve, which we've talked about in the past, that could have been passed down to Nimrod, if they still existed and Israel had hold of them, this is probably exactly where that would be. So that's a cool little connection that I never noticed before. But anyway, this female prophet, she says that God says, "Behold, I will bring disaster upon this place and upon its inhabitants. All the words of the book that the king of Judah has read, I will do. My wrath has been kindled, judgment is coming. I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace, and your eyes shall not see the disaster that I will bring upon this place." That's what he said to Josiah. He told Josiah, yes, all the disaster that you read about in the Torah for turning from me, it's going to happen. But don't worry, you'll die before you see it. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I guess it is a good thing. But the way it went down, the way that Josiah died, wait till we get to that part. It's so weird. And it's really the only reason that I think that maybe the Ark was involved. But I don't know. There are some missing pieces. You guys will figure it out once I get there. 2 Kings 23. Josiah basically, he gets it now. He realizes what he's done wrong, and he also realizes what he needs to do right, and he reestablishes the Passover, or all of the laws. But Passover is coming up, just so happens. So Josiah, he, tears down all the Asherah poles and all the wicked stuff, and he reinstates proper worship to the Lord. And then I believe it is shortly after the Passover, when the whole run-in with Pharaoh Necho happens. But the thing that is interesting about Pharaoh Necho is, why was Josiah this good king who had just realized what everyone has been doing wrong and what they need to do to get right? This guy's putting Israel back on track. He seems to be a good decision maker. But he goes to stand against Egypt in a war that he has nothing to do with. It's interesting. I don't understand. But hey, here's another passage that's pretty cool. It says in 2 Kings 23:22, no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or the kings of Judah. This means that David never kept Passover. Saul, Solomon, never kept Passover. No king of Israel. Ooh, wait, I know one. I know one besides Josiah. And also, it says it took 18 years before Josiah. I guess we can't blame him. He was literally a child. Some children are interested in hearing the stories and understanding God, but yeah, most aren't, which is cool. Maybe that's what the point of this is. Just because it's not it's not a topic that you're obsessed with, that doesn't mean that God is not in your heart. Josiah literally rediscovered the law. That's a big deal. If it weren't for him, the Bible may not exist today, at least in the way that we know it. So they hold their Passover, and then the weird part comes. They kind of give the typical closing here, like they're about to jump to the next king, where it says, all the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings? This is typically the ending, and then they jump to the next king. But the next verse instead shares this short little story of Josiah's death. It says, in his days, Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. You guys remember this? King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. That's what King says, the book of 2 Kings. And then Josiah's servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. And the people mourned, and the new king came. Well, the 2 Chronicles version of this is completely different. In 2 Chronicles, it says, more specifically, that Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, was going to fight the Battle of Carchemish, where he eventually loses to Babylon and then goes back home and never leaves his country again. This battle that Pharaoh Necho is headed to, and Josiah is trying to stop him, this is the battle that shuts Egypt up for the next 1,000 years. Even though it allows Babylon to step up and take over the world, this is ultimately the thing that shuts Egypt down as a superpower. But it says Josiah went out to meet him, and he sent envoys to him, saying, the Pharaoh sent envoys to Josiah, saying, what have we to do with each other, king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war, which would have been Babylon. And, it says, God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God, who is with me, lest he destroy you. Why would Pharaoh Necho think that? How is he talking to God? And why does he think that God told him to do this? We'll get back to that. Let's keep reading Chronicles. Nevertheless, Josiah did not turn away from him. Why would Josiah persist, even after hearing what he just heard? What he did instead was he disguised himself in order to fight with Pharaoh Necho. Why did he have to disguise himself? He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but he came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. So the Bible is even corroborating that the words that Necho said were from the mouth of God. So that's confirmation. How is Necho talking to God? How is this Pharaoh talking to God? And the archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, take me away, for I am badly wounded. So his servants took him out of his chariot and put him in a different chariot, and then brought him to Jerusalem. He died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. Totally different from 2 Kings. And it's got to be for a reason, right? So, basically, the theory is that during the reign of Manasseh, when everything was crazy, God-fearing Levites took the ark and left to Africa, where they hid it, supposedly, at Elephantine Island. This is the theory. Necho grew up and lived close to this area, so he would have been aware of it. Supposedly, even unto this day, there is a breakaway tribe of Levites that live in Ethiopia. Whether this is true or not, they believe it to be true. Pharaoh Necho was a key figure in the geopolitical upheaval that led to the Babylonian invasion of Judah, the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and ultimately the exile. His interactions illustrate Judah's precarious position between the great powers of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Necho claimed that God sent him on this mission, yet the outcome resulted in the death of Josiah, the silencing of the Egyptian kingdom, and the defeat of the Assyrian Empire. Necho sets up his own vassal king in Israel. He gets beat by Babylon and returns to Egypt. Then, as Nebuchadnezzar continues to build power, Egypt and Israel eventually fall under his control. After about 3 years of this, King Jehoiakim of Judah foolishly rebels, even though he is told by prophets not to interfere, just like Josiah. Jehoiakim dies, and then Jehoiachin takes over at 18 years old, and only 3 months later, Babylon invades. Nebuchadnezzar makes Jehoiachin's uncle, Mattaniah, the new vassal king, changes his name, as is the custom, to Zedekiah, and carries away all of the best treasures and people to Babylon. And this was only the first of 3 sieges Babylon would expose Israel to. And we never see the ark again. Let's back up a little bit. As I've said, some believe that during the reign of Manasseh, a group of Levites took the ark out of Jerusalem to escape the atrocities. According to this theory, the Israelites had allies in Seba. We'll explain later why. They moved the ark down the Nile to Elephantine Island in Egypt, where archaeological evidence shows a Jewish colony and a temple complex did exist in the 7th century BC. From there, it was purportedly moved further along the Nile to Tana Kirkos Island in Lake Tana, Ethiopia, and it was there for about 8 centuries, before finally being relocated to its current site at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. As of 2004, it was still believed to be there, or so the story goes. Some claim that Necho was not fully Egyptian, but rather part Ethiopian. This connection would explain why the Levites might have looked to him for protection, and how the ark could have eventually been transported to Elephantine Island, which did serve as a military fortress at the time. But this theory says that it eventually ended up in Ethiopia. But why Ethiopia? What's the connection with Seba? There is a 13th century Ethiopian epic called the Kebra Nagast, which claims that a man named Menelik I, who was the son of Solomon by the Queen of Sheba, had the ark brought to Ethiopia. There is a 2,000-year history of a designated guardian who watches over the sacred relic day and night, with a continuous, unbroken chain of succession until about 2004. The traditional account of this Solomonic tradition claims that Menelik I traveled to Jerusalem himself and took the ark back to Ethiopia in secret, leaving a replica behind in its place. While many scholars dismiss the legend of Menelik I taking the ark himself, there is an alternative path, that the Levites transported the ark up the Nile to Elephantine Island and eventually to Lake Tana to protect it during a time of apostasy in Jerusalem. The great Chuck Missler would often point out the difference between the ark and the mercy seat, suggesting that the latter is the true focus of future prophecy and not the box. Missler argues that the mercy seat is intended to become the throne from which Christ will rule on Mount Zion. These theories are connected to various scriptures, including Isaiah 18 regarding a gift to be presented to the Lord, and the account of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8, who was reading from Isaiah 53. Zephaniah 3:10 is also often used to suggest a people from Ethiopia will bring an offering or a gift to the Messiah at Mount Zion. So let's check these passages out. Isaiah 18 is a vision or an oracle being given to the prophet Isaiah by God about future events. And it says, "The land of whirling wings that is beyond the rivers of Cush," or also known as Nubia, very close to the region of Ethiopia, which sends ambassadors by the sea in vessels of papyrus on the waters. Another translation for this word papyrus would be reeds, boats made of reeds, or bulrushes, which is a tradition that the Ethiopians still use today. "Go, you swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth, to a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide." What land rests between two rivers? Mesopotamia, Babylon. And then it goes on to say, when you see the Lord coming, you hear the trumpet, and, he cuts away the evil. It says, "At that time, tribute will be brought to the Lord of hosts from a people tall and smooth, from a people feared near and far, a mighty nation and conquering, whose land the rivers divide, to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord of hosts." So, there will be an offering brought to the Lord by somebody on the day of the Lord. Let's go to Zephaniah 3:10. Says, kind of the same thing going on. He's going to cut off nations and redeem his people. And then verse 9 says, "For at that time I will change the speech of the peoples." Sorry, I started a little early, but let's roll with it, because it looks good. "I'll change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering." Okay, so the people beyond Cush, which would be in Africa, have some offering for the Lord. Where there are two or more witnesses, let a thing be true. So here it is. Now, let's check out the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. The angel says to Philip, go to the south, go to this road from Jerusalem to Gaza. And Philip doesn't ask any questions. He gets up and he goes. When he gets there, he finds a chariot with an Ethiopian eunuch. In Acts 8:27, it says that Peter arose and went, and there was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, who was the queen of the Ethiopians. And this eunuch was in charge of all of her treasure. What could potentially be in the treasure of the Ethiopians? This eunuch had come to Jerusalem to worship, and he was returning, seated in his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit said to Philip, "Go over and join his chariot." So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet, and asked, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the eunuch said, "How can I, unless someone guides me?" And so he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now the passage of scripture that he was reading was this: "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he opens not his mouth. In his humiliation justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth." Okay, and we know this is Isaiah 53. So let's go see what the treasurer of the Ethiopian queen was reading in Isaiah 53. "He was despised and rejected. He was pierced for our transgressions. We have all gone astray. Like a sheep before its shearers is silent, he opened not his mouth." Now, we have the gift of retrospect. So we know that this passage is talking about our Lord Jesus Christ. But the eunuch had to ask Philip, who is the writer speaking of, himself or someone else? Well, we should also know that what the eunuch was reading was not broken into chapter and verse like we see here. It was one, most likely, given his status in society, he probably had the entire scroll. So this is just a continuous, writing on a single page. So let's see what is right before Isaiah 53. The end of Isaiah 52. In Isaiah 52, well, let's start in 11. It says, "Depart, go out from there, touch no unclean thing. Go out from the midst of her and purify yourselves, you who bear the vessels of the Lord. For you shall not go out in haste, and you shall not go in flight. For the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard." So the same passage about the one who comes to bear our transgressions, it says, "You who bear the vessels, go." And then we have this Ethiopian eunuch who's connected to the treasuries of the queen, who's coming to Jerusalem. He's heard there's been a Messiah figure, and there's been plenty. I'm sure we all know this, that plenty of people claim to be the Messiah before and after Jesus, even still today. But when this eunuch got there was no Jesus, so he's confused. And it's very likely that he came bearing gifts. There are high-ranking officials in Ethiopia, including prior presidents, that have expressed a firm belief that they possess the true Ark. Whether they do or not isn't my point here. My point is that they firmly believe it. But there's yet another option. About 300 years before Necho, during the reign of King Rehoboam, and shortly after the Israel-Judah split, somewhere around 925 BC, a different pharaoh of Egypt named Shishak invaded Jerusalem. In 1 Kings 14:25, it says, "In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the shields of gold that Solomon had made." 2 Chronicles 12:2 through 9 expands on this story. It says that Shishak came with a large army, including Libyans and Cushites. He captured the fortified cities of Judah and reached Jerusalem. Because of Judah's unfaithfulness, God allowed the invasion. Rehoboam and the leaders humbled themselves, so Jerusalem was not destroyed, but Shishak carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shields Solomon had made. The key phrase is that he took everything from the temple treasures. Some interpreters have speculated that this could have included the Ark of the Covenant. Nearly all Egyptologists identify biblical Shishak with Shishonk I, the founder of the 22nd Libyan dynasty of Egypt. The name match is strong, the chronology aligns closely, and Shishonk left records of a major campaign into the southern Levant. There's a relief at Karnak that lists many conquered Canaanite places, from the Negev to Galilee. A fragment of a victory stela of Shishonk I was found at Megiddo, where Josiah fell, which confirms Egyptian conquest in the region. The Bible never plainly says the ark was taken. Not by Shishak, not by Necho, not by Nebuchadnezzar, not by the Queen of Sheba. In fact, later biblical references still speak as if the ark is present in the temple. Even during Josiah's reforms in 2 Chronicles 35:3, which is centuries after Shishak. The passage says, "Put the holy ark in the house that Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, built. You need not carry it on your shoulders." So, the ark is present when Josiah is king. Although some Ethiopians would suggest this was a replica. Who knows? The ark simply disappears from the biblical narrative before the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BC. Most historical reconstructions place its disappearance at the time of the Babylonian conquest, not 300 years earlier under Shishak. Something interesting that I think is worth noting here is that the Spirit, or the glory of the Lord, left the temple in a vision given to the prophet Ezekiel around 592 BC, which was the 6th year of King Jehoiachin's exile in Babylon, several years before the physical destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, which was 586 BC. The vision took place about 3 years before Necho's death in 595 BC, and this is also the last time we hear of the ark. The earthly Ark of the Covenant is not mentioned again in any historical narrative in the Bible after the time of Ezekiel's vision, around 592 BC. So is it possible that when the Lord left the temple, he took his throne with him? Perhaps. Jeremiah 3:16, which was written during or near the same period, looks forward to a future time when people will no longer say, "the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord." It will never enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. But in Revelation 11:19, there is a visionary appearance of the Ark of the Covenant in God's heavenly temple, which is widely understood as a heavenly or symbolic counterpart rather than the original earthly object. But who are we to say? We know there is a strong Christian and Jewish presence in Ethiopia and some believe it's been there since the Queen of Sheba traveled to witness the wisdom of King Solomon. Some believe that because Solomon was such a sucker for the ladies, and because we know he made foreign alliances, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to suggest the Queen of Sheba returned to her kingdom with the seed of Solomon. To be fair and painfully specific, the Queen of Sheba was most likely from the ancient kingdom of Seba in modern-day Yemen, not Ethiopia. However, Ethiopian tradition does identify her as an Ethiopian queen, and the two regions were closely linked in antiquity. But how is Pharaoh Shishak confused for an Ethiopian? The Bible itself does contribute to this occasional mix-up. In 2 Chronicles 12:3, Shishak's invading army is described as including the Lubim, which are Libyans, the Sukkim, and the Cushites, which is often translated as Ethiopians in older English versions. This means his forces contained Cushites, Nubians, and Sudanese allies, which was common in Egyptian armies of that period. It does not mean that Shishak himself was Cushite or Ethiopian, but the two regions were closely linked in antiquity. True Cushite rule over the land of Egypt came later, during the 25th dynasty, around 747 to 656 BC, long after Shishak's time, about 200 years after. And this Cushite reign doesn't last very long, because by the time we get to Necho, around 600 BC, true-blooded Egyptians are back in power. Or at least, that's the campaign slogan. And that is my rant on the Lost Ark. God bless, Godspeed, peace.